Late spring, 1945. A humid Pacific island, still smelling of smoke and antiseptic. Canvas tents stretch across a cleared field, their flaps moving with the slow rhythm of exhausted hands. Inside one of them, the sound is not gunfire, but breathing. Shallow, uneven, human. American doctors move quickly under hanging lamps, sleeves rolled, hands steady. Stretchers arrive in no particular order. No flags, no ranks, no nationality spoken aloud. Along the edge of the tent, Japanese women stand silently. Some are nurses. Some are civilians pulled from caves and shattered villages. Their clothes are torn, their faces rigid with shock, not fear of death, but confusion. They watch as American medics stop beside a wounded Japanese woman. She's treated first, before officers, before soldiers, before any end in Imperial Japan. This order made no sense. It violated everything they had been taught about duty, honor, and worth. And yet the doctors do not hesitate. They follow a different rule, one that will quietly unravel years of wartime belief. Understand why this moment broke something deep inside those watching. We must step back to the world that shaped both sides of that tent. Be why the time American doctors began treating Japanese women ahead of their own wounded men. The war in the Pacific had already stripped away illusion after illusion. Yet for Imperial Japan, one belief remained largely intact until the very end, that sacrifice, hierarchy, and obedience defined a person's worth, even in medicine. Before the war, Japan's medical system was rigidly structured, shaped by military necessity and social order. Care flowed downward from rank. Officers first, soldiers next, civilians last. Women, unless serving a direct military function, stood at the very bottom. This hierarchy hardened as the war intensified. Imperial Japanese Army doctrine was deeply influenced by Bushido, the warrior code revived and reshaped by the modern state. It emphasized endurance over comfort, death over surrender, and duty over survival. Wounds were not merely injuries. They were tests of character. To require urgent care was, in some contexts, a quiet admission of weakness. Medical manuals issued to Japanese military doctors reflected this worldview. Treatment priority was often guided by soldiers' likelihood of returning to battle, not by the severity of injury. Men who could fight again were more valuable than those who could not. Civilians were rarely considered at all. Women occupied a contradictory position. Japanese nurses, many trained through organizations like the Japanese Red Cross, were respected for discipline and service, yet still bound by strict gender expectations. They existed to support male endurance, not to supersede it. A woman receiving priority care over a man, especially a soldier, would have been unthinkable in pre-war Japan. As the Pacific War worsened, these rules became harsher rather than looser. On islands like Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, medical resources were scarce. Doctors faced impossible choices. In many cases, wounded soldiers were encouraged or ordered to endure pain in silence. Morphine was limited. Surgery without anesthesia was not uncommon. Civilians were frequently left untreated altogether. Japanese propaganda reinforced this structure relentlessly. Posters, radio broadcasts, and field indoctrination taught that women and civilians should sacrifice themselves for the empire. Stories circulated of mothers urging sons to fight on rather than seek care. Survival was honorable only if it served victory. By 1944 and 1945, as American forces advanced island by island, Japanese civilians were increasingly drawn into the front lines. Entire communities were caught between collapsing defenses and overwhelming Allied firepower. Caves became shelters. Schools became aid stations. Nurses found themselves tending civilians alongside soldiers, often without supplies. That was in this chaos that first contact with American medical units occurred at U.S. Army and Navy doctors landed alongside infantry. They built aid stations within hours. Field hospitals followed close behind. Their tents were marked clearly. Their procedures were fast, methodical, and unfamiliar. For Japanese civilians and nurses emerging from hiding, the sight alone was disorienting. American medical teams did not separate the wounded by nationality. They did not ask for allegiance. They did not demand proof of loyalty or service. They asked only one question: how badly are you hurt? At first, many Japanese assumed this was a trick or a temporary kindness before execution. Years of wartime messaging had taught them that surrender meant death, especially at the hands of Americans portrayed as brutal and vengeful. But the hours passed. The doctors kept working. And the rules inside those tents did not change. The Japanese women watching. Something far deeper than battlefield control was about to be challenged. Not by weapons, but by a completely different idea of human value. While Japanese wartime medicine was built around hierarchy and endurance, American military medicine entered the Pacific guided by a different foundation, one shaped by industrial warfare, humanitarian law, and hard lessons learned in earlier conflicts. By 1941, the United States Army Medical Department had undergone extensive modernization. Experiences from World War I, combined with advances in surgery, anesthesia, and logistics, had reshaped how American doctors understood survival on the battlefield. The goal was no longer simply to keep soldiers fighting, but to preserve life wherever possible. Central to this system was triage. American medics were trained to sort the wounded not by rank, nationality, or role, but by urgency. Those who would die without immediate intervention came first. Those who could wait came later. Those beyond saving were made as comfortable as possible. It was a cold system on paper, but one designed to save the greatest number of lives. This doctrine was taught rigorously. Medical officers were instructed that personal judgment, prejudice, or emotion could not interfere with triage decisions. A private could outrank a colonel if his wounds were more severe. A civilian child could be treated before a decorated veteran if the situation demanded it. The Geneva Conventions, particularly the 1929 Convention relative to the treatment of prisoners of war, reinforced these principles. While Japan had signed but not fully implemented the conventions, the United States took them seriously as both law and doctrine. Medical personnel were trained to treat enemy wounded when possible, and civilians when encountered in the Pacific. This approach was tested constantly. The island campaigns produced massive casualties in compressed spaces. Heat, infection, and delayed evacuation made every minute critical. American field hospitals had to function under fire, often within range of Japanese artillery or sniper positions. Despite this, medical units maintained their procedures. Surgeons worked in shifts around the clock. Nurses managed shock, dehydration, and burns. Blood plasma and penicillin, still new and precious, were used wherever they could save a life. Crucially, American doctrine made no distinction between men and women in medical urgency. Female patients were not unusual. Nurses, civilian women, and children had been treated in Europe, North Africa, and the Pacific alike. To American doctors, gender was medically irrelevant. This indifference to hierarchy extended even to the enemy. Reports from campaigns like Guadalcanal and New Guinea show American medics treating wounded Japanese soldiers alongside Americans when circumstances allowed. In some cases, enemy wounded were stabilized before American casualties who could wait. The practice was not framed as mercy. It was framed as medicine. Many American doctors later wrote that once a patient was on the table, uniforms disappeared. The body in front of them was simply a body in crisis. Bleeding did not care about flags. Infection did not recognize ideology. When Japanese women were brought into these field hospitals, often carried by Marines or Army medics who had found them wounded in caves or destroyed villages, they entered a system that made no effort to explain itself. The doctors did not announce their principles. They did not justify their choices. They simply acted that a Japanese woman with severe blood loss would be moved forward. A Japanese officer with a less critical wound would be told to wait. An American private with a fractured arm would be set aside while surgeons worked on a civilian child. American staff. This was routine. To the Japanese women watching, It was incomprehensible. Every moment inside those tents quietly contradicted what they had been taught since childhood. That men endured first, that women sacrificed silently, and that the enemy showed no mercy as the hours passed, and the order remained unchanged. Confusion gave way to something more unsettling. The realization that the Americans were not breaking their rules at all. They were following them perfectly. That realization would be felt differently by everyone who witnessed it. Nurses, civilians, soldiers, and even the wounded men themselves. And it is through those perspectives that the true weight of this moment becomes clear. The shock of American medical priority did not arrive all at once. It unfolded quietly, in glances, in stillness, in the slow recognition that the order inside the tent was not going to change. 4 Japanese women present in these hospitals, whether nurses, civilians, or refugees, the moment cut across several layers of belief at the same time. The human angle was the most immediate. Many of the women had been taught that their lives were secondary by definition. From childhood, wartime education emphasized endurance, silence, and self-erasure. Pain was to be borne without complaint. Survival, if it came at the expense of men fighting for the empire, was considered shameful. Some civilians on Saipan and Okinawa had been told outright that capture was worse than death. When American medics lifted wounded women onto tables ahead of men, the reaction was not relief. It was disbelief. Some resisted treatment. Others bowed or apologized repeatedly, unable to reconcile care with worth. Nurses who had spent years stepping aside for male patients now found themselves being ordered, firmly but calmly, to sit, to drink water, to allow wounds to be cleaned. Tears followed, not because of pain, but because of collapse. A moral structure had failed in front of them, and there was no language to replace it. The cultural angle deepened that rupture. In Imperial Japan, gender roles during war were tightly prescribed. Men fought. Women supported. Even within medical spaces, authority flowed through male bodies. Female nurses were disciplined, respected, but never prioritized. To receive care before a man suggested inversion of natural order. American doctors, unaware or unconcerned with this framework, treated urgency as the only hierarchy. A woman hemorrhaging from shrapnel wounds became the most important person in the room. A wounded officer with stable vitals could wait. The logic was clinical, not ideological, but its effect was profound. For Japanese women watching this unfold, the message was not spoken, but it was unmistakable. Suffering was not proof of honor, and endurance was not a prerequisite for care. The medical angle reinforced this message relentlessly. American triage was visibly systematic. Medics checked breathing, pulse, responsiveness. Tags were attached. Stretchers moved. There was no favoritism, no hesitation. The process repeated again and again, confirming that the first woman treated had not been an exception. Japanese nurses present in these hospitals later described the experience as deeply disorienting. They had been trained to subordinate themselves, to assist male doctors, to accept deprivation as normal. Watching women, some civilians, some fellow nurses, receive immediate surgery or transfusions shattered the assumption that medicine must mirror military hierarchy. This was not kindness in the emotional sense. It was precision, and precision, repeated under pressure, carried its own moral weight. As the hours passed, the reactions inside the tent began to diverge. Some women wept openly. Others stared in silence. A few watched the men waiting on stretchers and saw something they had never been allowed to see before. Confusion. Because for the first time, the order of the world had shifted, and it had done so without apology. That shift did not go unnoticed by the men themselves. While Japanese women absorbed the shock in silence or tears, the reaction among wounded Japanese men, soldiers, officers, and auxiliaries unfolded differently, yet carried equal weight. The enemy perspective was marked first by confusion, then by unease. Many of the men lying on stretchers had been raised to believe that women existed to endure quietly behind them. They had marched, fought, and bled under an ideology that promised honor through suffering and death. Medical care, when given, was framed as a means to return them to battle, not as a right. When American medics passed them by to reach a wounded woman, the moment landed like a blow. Some tried to rise. Others protested weakly. A few looked away, unwilling to watch what they believed should not happen. But the doctors did not respond to rank or protest. They checked vitals. They followed protocol. They moved on. This indifference to status was not humiliating in a dramatic sense. It was worse. It was impersonal. The American doctors were not making a statement. They were not trying to shame. They were simply refusing to acknowledge the hierarchy at all. For Japanese officers in particular, this was destabilizing. Authority in Imperial Japan was absolute and visible. To see it dissolve silently inside a medical tent suggested that power itself could be ignored, not challenged, just rendered irrelevant. The American medical ethics angle explains why.u.s. Doctors in the Pacific did not see themselves as moral actors in these moments. Their training emphasized detachment under pressure. Emotion was a risk. Bias was a liability. Every deviation from triage increased the chance of unnecessary death. Many American surgeons later recalled that they were only vaguely aware of how shocking their actions appeared. They noticed hesitation, resistance, fear, but they interpreted it as trauma, not ideology. Their responsibility, as they understood it, was to stop bleeding, fight infection, and stabilize patients as quickly as possible. In their reports, they did not describe treating women first as an act of mercy. They described it as correct procedure. That distinction mattered, because mercy implies choice. Procedure implies inevitability. The Japanese watching. This made the experience more powerful. The Americans were not bending rules out of compassion. They were obeying rules that placed human need above gender, above nationality, above honor. The moral angle emerges here, not as judgment, but as contrast. Total war had taught both sides to dehumanize. Yet within these tents, dehumanization had no function. A wounded body demanded attention regardless of uniform or ideology. The Americans were not attempting reconciliation. They were practicing medicine in its most stripped-down form. Japanese nurses later noted that what unsettled them most was the absence of ceremony. There were no speeches, no moral lectures, no acknowledgement of gratitude expected. Treatment was given, and the doctors moved on to the next patient. For women who had been taught that their lives were expendable, this lack of performance was overwhelming. It suggested that dignity did not need to be earned. It existed already. By the time these field hospitals filled with wounded from major battles, Saipan in mid-1944, Okinawa in early 1945, the pattern was unmistakable. Women were treated when they needed it. Men waited when they could. The order held, even under fire. This was not a single incident. It was a system in motion, and it reached its most intense expression during the battles where civilians and soldiers were wounded together, in numbers that strained every tent, every surgeon, every belief. That is where the quiet shock turned into something irreversible, where disbelief gave way to tears, and where the meaning of the war itself began to fracture, not on the battlefield, but on the operating table. Why the summer of 1944, the war in the Pacific had reached a phase where separation between battlefield and civilian life no longer existed. The American landing on Saipan, followed by Tinian and later Okinawa, produced casualties on a scale that overwhelmed every assumption about control, order, and endurance. On Saipan, entire Japanese families fled into the island's northern cliffs as U.S. forces advanced. Artillery fire, naval bombardment, and airstrikes collapsed caves and shelters. When American medics reached these areas, they encountered not only wounded soldiers, but women, children, and elderly civilians, many suffering from shrapnel wounds, burns, dehydration, and shock. Field hospitals were established within hours of landing. Canvas tents went up under fire. Surgical tables were set on packed earth. Blood plasma was unpacked and rationed. The flow of wounded never stopped. Inside these hospitals, triage became relentless. American medics assessed patients as they arrived, often carried by Marines who had found them in caves or rubble. Japanese civilians were brought in alongside American infantrymen and wounded Japanese soldiers. There was no time for sorting by category, only by condition. Women with abdominal wounds or severe blood loss were moved immediately to surgery. Children with blast injuries were stabilized first. Men with less critical injuries were tagged to wait, regardless of rank. On Okinawa in 1945, this pattern intensified. The island's dense civilian population meant that American medical units encountered thousands of wounded non-combatants. Japanese nurses and civilian women, many of whom had been conscripted into support roles, found themselves in American care after frontline positions collapsed. Eyewitness reports from U.S. Navy medical personnel described Japanese women arriving in groups, silent, rigid, some barely conscious. When treated first, many showed visible distress rather than relief. Some attempted to refuse anesthesia. Others clutched at medics, crying without speaking. The doctors did not stop to explain. They cleaned wounds. They administered plasma. They operated. In several documented cases, wounded Japanese officers lay nearby, watching as women were taken ahead of them. There are accounts of officers attempting to assert authority, only to be gently but firmly ignored. The American response was consistent. Treatment would be given when medically necessary, not when demanded. For Japanese nurses present, this was the breaking point. They had been trained to accept suffering as service, to place themselves last, to support male endurance even at the cost of their own health. Seeing women treated first, repeatedly, systematically, collapsed the logic that had governed their professional lives. One U.S. Army report noted that Japanese female patients often became emotional during or after treatment, while male patients remained withdrawn or silent. The report did not speculate why. It did not need to. The reason was visible in the room. The medical tent had become a space where wartime ideology no longer applied, and as the casualty numbers rose, this reversal did not soften. It intensified. Surgeons worked without pause. Nurses moved between tables. Blood was rationed by need, not by uniform. The same rules applied whether the patient wore American olive drab or civilian clothing pulled from a cave. By the time Okinawa reached its bloodiest weeks, the meaning of priority had been stripped down to a single fact: who would die next if nothing was done? For the Japanese women witnessing this, there was no way to reconcile what they were seeing with what they had been taught. Something fundamental had broken, and it would not be repaired. The battle for Okinawa dragged into its final months. Exhaustion replaced shock. What remained was clarity, unavoidable, relentless, and deeply unsettling for those who watched American medicine operate without compromise. By May and June of 1945, American field hospitals were processing thousands of casualties every week. The lines outside surgical tents never shortened. The stench of blood and antiseptic hung constantly in the air. There was no time for ceremony, and no space left for ideology. Japanese women, nurses, civilians, auxiliaries, had now seen the pattern too many times to dismiss it as coincidence. They watched as American doctors knelt beside a wounded woman, assessed her breathing, and waved her forward while injured men were told to wait. They watched surgeons choose based on pulse strength and blood loss, not rank or gender. They watched men, some officers, some conscripts, lower their eyes as women were carried past them. And then something changed. The resistance stopped. Eyewitness account from U.S. medical units described Japanese patients no longer objecting to triage decisions. Some men, understanding the system at last, gestured toward wounded women and urged medics to treat them first. Others lay still, conserving strength, accepting the delay without protest. For the women, the emotional release was delayed but overwhelming. U.S. Navy nurses later recalled Japanese women crying silently during treatment, not from pain, but from what they described as confusion mixed with relief. For many, it was the first time their suffering had been acknowledged without condition. No sacrifice was required. No explanation demanded. The tears came because the rules had been suspended and never reinstated. American doctors did not interpret these reactions philosophically. They documented vital signs. They recorded outcomes. They moved on. But in doing so, they demonstrated something the Japanese system had not: consistency under pressure. The triage rules did not bend when casualties increased. They did not shift to favor Americans when supplies ran low. They did not change when enemy wounded filled the tents. This refusal to adapt ideology to convenience made the system impossible to dismiss as propaganda. By the time Japanese surrender was imminent, many civilians and nurses had come to a realization that was both painful and irreversible. The enemy they had been taught to fear was not cruel in the way they had been warned, nor were they kind in the way mercy had been imagined. They were something more unsettling. They were indifferent to the structures that had defined worth for decades. This indifference carried its own moral force. It suggested that hierarchy was optional, that suffering was not a virtue, that life did not need justification. For Japanese women whose identities had been shaped by endurance and obedience, this realization arrived too late to change the war, but not too late to change how they understood themselves. As the guns fell silent in August 1945, the memory of those tents remained, not as symbols of defeat, but as places where the war's deepest assumptions had quietly collapsed. What followed would determine how that collapse echoed into the aftermath. The surrender of Japan in August 1945 marked the end of organized combat in the Pacific, but the consequences of the battles and the medical encounters within them continued to unfold in the months that followed. The women who had witnessed American doctors prioritizing their care before male soldiers carried the memory of those moments long after the guns fell silent. In the immediate aftermath, field hospitals remained active. Many islands, including Okinawa and Saipan, were littered with wounded civilians, displaced families, and surviving soldiers who had endured months of combat. American medical units continued to operate under the same triage principles: urgency over rank, injury over ideology. For Japanese women, this meant continued access to treatment that was previously unimaginable. Reports from U.S. Army nurses and surgeons described Japanese women receiving surgical care, blood transfusions, and convalescence in temporary wards alongside other civilians. Many had sustained severe burns, fractures, or shrapnel injuries from bombings and artillery. Their presence in hospitals forced American doctors to continually balance resources while maintaining adherence to triage. Each successful treatment reinforced the message: care was not a privilege to be earned, but a right accorded according to need. The psychological impact on Japanese nurses and female civilians was profound. Diaries and post-war interviews recount an initial inability to accept care without guilt. Some wept before and after procedures, expressing a mixture of relief and shame. Others wrote of a long-term struggle to reconcile these experiences with the societal expectations ingrained over years of propaganda and military training. For decades, women were taught that their suffering was secondary. In the field hospitals, they had become the first to receive attention, overturning a lifetime of conditioning. Male patients, meanwhile, experienced the collapse of hierarchy differently. Wounded soldiers and officers were forced to confront a system in which their status and honor did not dictate priority. Some reportedly expressed resentment or disbelief, while others gradually understood the necessity of medical efficiency. By prioritizing survival, American medics imposed a moral framework foreign to imperial Japanese ideology, one where value was determined by need, not rank or gender. American reports also note the impact on local communities. Women who survived treatment often became de facto witnesses to a different model of social and medical ethics. Communities began to recognize that practical care, rather than rigid adherence to traditional hierarchy, could save lives. This shift, though subtle, planted seeds of change that would influence post-war reconstruction and civilian medical practices in Japan. The immediacy of survival overshadowed broader reflection at the time. Yet the cumulative effect of these field hospitals, hundreds of women treated alongside civilians and soldiers, produced a psychological imprint that persisted through the surrender, occupation, and eventual rebuilding of Japanese society. As the weeks turned into months, the war's casualties were tallied. On Okinawa alone, more than 100,000 Japanese civilians were killed or wounded, and tens of thousands survived under the care of American medical units. Within these numbers, the stories of Japanese women receiving treatment before men stood out not as anomalies, but as testaments to a radically different approach to human life. This period of medical intervention also had practical consequences for occupation policy. Women who survived became vital to rebuilding local infrastructure, healthcare, and education. Their recovery, enabled by American medical procedures, ensured that critical knowledge and labor could be reintegrated into society. In this way, what happened within the tents during the final battles had ripple effects far beyond the immediate clinical context. The human and cultural shock of these moments would continue to resonate, shaping the survivors' perception of both the enemy and the meaning of care in times of war. And yet, even amid this recovery, one lesson became unavoidable. What had been witnessed inside those hospitals had permanently altered the moral landscape of survival. As the occupation of Japan began in late 1945, the experiences of Japanese women treated by American doctors became part of a larger reckoning. Beyond immediate survival, these encounters left lasting impressions on both individuals and society, shaping attitudes toward medicine, authority, and morality. Many women who had been nurses before or during the war later testified that seeing American doctors treat them first challenged lifelong beliefs about worth and duty. Diaries and post-war interviews reveal a mixture of awe, guilt, and disbelief. Some described weeping quietly as their wounds were cleaned and sutured. Others recounted an uneasy silence, realizing that the rigid social hierarchy that had governed their lives was irrelevant in the medical tent. Survival had become the only priority. The broader Japanese male population, soldiers and civilians alike, struggled differently. Officers who had been raised to expect obedience and deference now witnessed their own wounded men waiting behind women and children. Some eventually accepted the practice, recognizing the efficiency and necessity of triage. Others held resentment or confusion, a reflection of the cognitive dissonance between centuries of cultural indoctrination and the practical morality of American wartime medicine. Occupying authorities and medical units reported that these experiences had practical consequences. Women who survived and recovered often took central roles in rebuilding healthcare infrastructure, caring for children, and assisting in community restoration. Their recovery, facilitated by American triage, indirectly contributed to the stabilization of post-war Japan. By prioritizing need over hierarchy, the U.S. military had not only preserved lives, but also empowered a generation of women to assume roles previously constrained by social and wartime norms. The impact was not only practical, but psychological. In multiple post-war surveys and interviews, women reflected on a deep shift in their understanding of human value. The principle that suffering should dictate priority rather than status created a lasting impression. Many nurses carried this perspective into civilian medical work, teaching a generation that care could be administered impartially, based on need rather than rank or gender. Even for men who had survived the battles, the memory of these tents lingered. Witnessing women receive treatment first forced reconsideration of the rigid moral codes that had governed their behavior. It exposed the vulnerability of ideology in the face of human necessity. The psychological shock, while subtle, influenced post-war attitudes toward authority, gender, and survival. That be why the time Japanese hospitals and clinics stabilized under occupation. The precedent had been set. The U.S. military's unwavering adherence to triage demonstrated that medicine could function independently of politics, culture, or ideology. In a society recovering from total war, this example carried profound ethical implications. From field hospitals on the beaches of Saipan to surgical tents under Okinawan sun, the principle had been clear. Human need, not social rank, dictates care. This realization, witnessed firsthand by Japanese women, would echo far beyond the battlefield, shaping the post-war recovery of both individuals and institutions. The stage was now set for reflection, a calm, philosophical conclusion on what this moment truly meant for history, humanity, and the ethics of warfare. The story of Japanese women receiving treatment before their own men is more than a historical footnote. It is a study in the collision of ideology and necessity, of culture and principle, of human life measured by need rather than status. In the field hospitals of the Pacific, hierarchy and tradition held no power. American doctors treated each patient according to urgency, guided by training, logic, and law, not by nationality, rank, or gender. The women who wept were not simply responding to physical relief. They were witnessing the collapse of a moral framework that had defined their existence. In a single surgical tent, decades of indoctrination were quietly undone. This moment carries profound lessons about the nature of warfare and humanity. It demonstrates that compassion can exist in the most mechanical systems, that efficiency need not be cruel, and that human dignity can be recognized even amid total conflict. For Japanese women, this was a lesson learned not through words but through action. Care itself became the messenger. The broader historical significance extends beyond individual experience. Triage, impartiality, and the prioritization of survival over ideology became a subtle tool of influence, reshaping how communities understood morality, gender roles, and responsibility. It showed that the ethics of medicine could challenge the ethics of war, leaving a lasting imprint on those who witnessed in the calm after battle. The images linger. Tents filled with wounded, doctors moving with precision, women receiving care first, tears falling quietly onto bloodied sheets. These images are not heroic in a conventional sense, nor are they sensational. They are cinematic because they reveal the extraordinary within the ordinary, the human within the machinery of war. The legacy of these moments is enduring. They remind us that even in the most violent and dehumanizing circumstances, small acts of impartial care can reshape perception, alter behavior, and illuminate the universal value of life. For the Japanese women who wept in those tents, for the men who waited beside them, and for the doctors who acted without pause, this truth was made unmistakably clear. Humanity, when prioritized over ideology, can survive even the most devastating of conflicts.